The city of New York had never felt colder than the night the NYU dorms became a memory, and the heavy scent of old tobacco and failure became Isabella Romano's new reality. It started with a phone call, a jagged, panicked sound that ripped through the quiet of a Tuesday night study session. Her father, William, wasn't a bad man. He was a man with a hole in his soul that only the turn of a card could fill. But that night, the cards had turned into a noose. Subscribe to this channel as we continue this story. Isabella arrived at the basement apartment in Queens to find the front door off its hinges and her father huddled on the floor, his breath coming in shallow, terrified hitches. Standing over him was a man she would later know as Tommy Barnes, a mid-level enforcer with a cheap trench coat and eyes that saw human beings as nothing more than ledgers to be balanced. The air in the cramped room was thick with the smell of stale beer and the metallic tang of fear. 150,000, Charlie. Sorry, Isabella, Tommy had sneered, using the name her father had whispered in a moment of weakness. Your old man here thought he could outrun the Sullivans. Turns out the Sullivans don't like runners, they like earners. The weight of the number felt like a physical blow. Isabella was a nursing student. She understood anatomy, the way the heart pumped and the way bones broke. She looked at her father's trembling hands and realized that if she didn't act, those hands would be the first things the Sullivans took. There was no $150,000 in a college savings account. There was only the $2,000 she had saved from 3 part-time jobs and the terrifying realization that her life, as she knew it, was over. The deal was brokered through a shadow agency that dealt in debts of the soul. The Sullivans would pause the interest on William's debt, but the price was Isabella's total surrender. She was to become a ghost in the house of their greatest enemy, Luca Morty. The agency told her it was a maid's position, but the reality was far grimmer. She was a biological insurance policy, a pair of eyes inside the Morty fortress, and a source of income that saw 70% of her exorbitant salary handed over to Tommy Barnes in the rain-slicked shadows of a back alley every Friday night. The transition was a blur of grief. She withdrew from NYU, packed her life into 2 suitcases, and watched the skyline of Manhattan recede as a black town car carried her toward the Sands Point estate. The Morty property was less of a home and more of a billionaire's military bunker, a 3-story fortress of stone and iron where silence was the only language spoken. On her first day, the head housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, hadn't offered a welcome. She had offered a set of chains disguised as rules. You are to be a ghost, the woman had said, her voice as stiff as her ironed collar. You do not speak unless spoken to. You do not look Mr. Morty in the eye. You see nothing, you hear nothing, and you clean everything. For 8 months, Isabella lived within those margins. She learned the rhythms of a house that hummed with the quiet energy of a war machine. She learned to polish the sub-zero refrigerators before the sun touched the Long Island Sound, and to disappear into the servants' quarters the moment the gravel driveway crunched under the weight of a fleet of black SUVs. She became an expert at invisibility, a petite figure in a blue and white apron who existed only to erase the fingerprints of men who dictated the fate of the city. She rarely saw Luca Morty, and when she did, it was as if a predator had momentarily crossed her path. He was a man carved from ice and shadow, tall, broad-shouldered, and radiating an aura of absolute authority that made the air in the room grow thick and heavy. He never looked at her. He never spoke. To him, she was just another piece of the expensive furniture, a utility that kept his coffee hot and his floors spotless. But every Friday, the reality of her ransom returned. She would meet Tommy Barnes near the incinerator at the back of the estate, a blind spot in the thermal cameras where the ancient oak trees provided a canopy of secrets. She would hand over the envelope of cash, feeling the eyes of the Irish mob on her, reminding her that her father's pulse was tied directly to her obedience. It was a life of quiet desperation, a nursing student's hands now stained not with the healing tinctures of a hospital, but with the dust of a mafia boss' secrets. She was trapped between 2 monsters, the one who demanded her money and the one who demanded her silence. She told herself she could endure it. She told herself that as long as she followed the rules, the 2 worlds would never collide. She was wrong. The collision happened on a Tuesday night in late October, when a medical bill for her father's failing liver left her $2,000 short. The panic had driven her into the cold night air, hoping the rain would wash away the terror of the upcoming collection day. Instead, it had brought Tommy Barnes out of the shadows, not to collect, but to remind her of the price of failure. The strike had been sudden and brutal. The force of his hand across her face had sent her sprawling onto the wet pavement, her vision blurring as her cheekbone flared with agonizing heat. "Tomorrow, Charlie," he had whispered, his breath smelling of stale beer and malice. "Or your dad is dead." As she dragged herself back into the cavernous kitchen, seeking the only room where she felt a shred of control, she didn't know that the blood on her face had just signed a death warrant. She didn't know that the silence of the Morty estate was about to be replaced by the roar of a bloodbath. She only knew that she was a daughter who had paid her ransom in skin and tears, and that for the first time in 8 months, she couldn't stop crying. The Morty estate was a monument to silence and cold, gray stone, a fortress perched on the jagged edge of Long Island, where the Atlantic's roar was the only thing loud enough to challenge the authority within its walls. For Isabella, the transition from the frantic, siren-filled nights of her NYU dormitory to the oppressive stillness of the mansion had been a slow-motion drowning. In this house, air was a luxury, and visibility was a death sentence. The rules were established on her very first morning by Mrs. Gable, a woman whose face looked like it had been carved from the same granite as the foyer. There were 3 commandments that governed Isabella's existence. First, she was never to be seen by Luca Morty unless she was placing a tray or clearing a glass. Second, she was never to speak unless a direct question was leveled at her. Third, and most importantly, she was to be a shadow, present enough to ensure the silver gleamed and the linens smelled of lavender, but absent enough that the master of the house could forget a living soul shared his oxygen. Isabella leaned into the role of a ghost with a desperation born of survival. Her days became a rhythmic, mechanical blur of labor. She learned which floorboards in the West Wing groaned under a footstep, and which hallways to avoid when the heavy front doors opened to admit men with hard eyes and bulges beneath their tailored suit jackets. She became a master of the peripheral vision, keeping her head bowed so low that she memorized the intricate patterns of the Persian rugs better than the faces of the people she served. The emotional toll of being a nonentity was a weight she carried in the hollow of her chest. In her previous life, she had been a healer in training, her hands used to comfort and her voice used to reassure. Now, her hands were perpetually red from industrial cleaners, and her voice was a rusted instrument she only used to whisper prayers for her father's safety. She lived in a small, sterile room in the servants' quarters, a space devoid of personal touch, because to leave a mark on the room was to admit she existed. Her only connection to the world she had lost was the monthly letter she sent to her father, scrubbed of any detail that might betray her location or her fear. She wrote about the grand library and the beautiful gardens, painting a picture of a prestigious domestic position that didn't involve guarding her breathing every time a black SUV pulled into the drive. She didn't tell him that she felt like a prisoner in a gilded cage, or that the sight of Luca Morty's silhouette in the distance made her heart hammer against her ribs like a trapped bird. Luca was the sun around which the entire dark solar system of the estate revolved. Even when he wasn't in the room, his presence was a physical pressure. Isabella would find traces of him everywhere, the scent of expensive tobacco and cedarwood lingering in the study, a discarded silk tie on the arm of a leather chair, or the terrifyingly heavy silence that followed his departures. On the rare occasions their paths crossed, she would flatten herself against the wall, her eyes fixed on his polished Oxfords, holding her breath until the air settled and he was gone. He was a predator of the highest order, and she was the smallest of prey, surviving only because she stayed out of the light. The struggle to remain a ghost was most difficult during the late hours of the night. That was when the nursing student, Isabella, fought the maid, Isabella. She would hear the muffled sounds of the world outside, the distant hum of a boat on the Sound or the wind rattling the heavy window panes, and she would feel the crushing urge to scream, to assert that she was Isabella Romano, a woman with dreams and a name, not just the girl who cleans the East bathrooms. She found solace in the kitchen during the dead of night, the one place where the industrial stainless steel and the organized rows of copper pots felt familiar, reminiscent of the labs she once excelled in. There, she could pretend for a few minutes that she was just a student pulling an all-nighter. She would stir a pot of tea or organize the pantry with clinical precision, using the work to ground her fracturing identity. But as the months bled into one another, the fortress began to feel less like a hiding place and more like a tomb. The isolation was an acid, eating away at her resolve. Every Friday payment to the Sullivans reminded her that her ghostly status was the only thing keeping the wolves from her father's door. She told herself she was strong enough to fade away, to be the invisible thread that kept the Morty house running without ever being caught in the weave. She didn't realize that in a house built on secrets and blood, no one stayed a ghost forever. Eventually, the shadows always find a way to bleed into the light. The Friday air was thick with a damp, clinging fog that rolled in from the Long Island Sound, turning the manicured gardens of the Morty estate into a labyrinth of shifting gray shapes. For Isabella, this was the most dangerous hour of the week. While the rest of the household settled into the deep, heavy silence of a Friday night, she had to navigate the dead zone, a sliver of the property near the old stone incinerator, where the high-tech thermal cameras were blocked by the dense, ancient canopy of weeping willows. She moved with the practiced stealth of someone who had learned to fear her own shadow. Her breath hitched in her chest, coming out in small, ghostly plumes as she clutched the manila envelope to her ribs. Inside was $2,000, every cent of her weekly wages, plus the meager tips she had scavenged from the laundry room and the loose change left on the study desks. It was the price of her father's life, and tonight she knew it wasn't enough. The medical bills for her father's failing liver had gutted her savings, leaving a $2,000 hole in the payment the Sullivan syndicate expected. The incinerator loomed out of the mist like a jagged tooth. Isabella stopped, her heart hammering against her sternum so loudly she was certain the security teams in the main house would hear it. For a moment, there was only the sound of the distant tide slapping against the pier. Then, a twig snapped. "You're late, Charlie," a voice rasped from the darkness. Tommy Barnes stepped out from behind a massive oak, his cheap trench coat dark with moisture. He looked profoundly out of place against the backdrop of the Morty grandeur, a scavenger lurking in a king's garden. He didn't offer a greeting, he only held out a fleshy, scarred hand. Isabella stepped forward, her legs feeling like lead, and handed him the envelope. She watched his face as he flicked through the bills. The grease from his fingers left smudges on the crisp currency. As he reached the end, his expression shifted from greedy anticipation to a cold, jagged sneer. He looked up, his eyes narrow and predatory. "This is light, Isabella," he said, his voice dropping an octave, losing its conversational edge. "Way light. We talked about this. The Sullivans aren't a charity. We don't do payment plans for nursing school dropouts." "My father, he needed the medicine, Tommy," Isabella whispered, her voice trembling. "The liver complications, they got worse. I'll have the rest by next Friday. I'll work double shifts. I'll find a way, I swear." "Next Friday doesn't keep the boss happy today," Tommy interrupted, stepping into her personal space. The smell of stale cigarettes and cheap bourbon rolled off him, a violent intrusion into the clean, saltaire scent of the estate. "You think because you're living in this fancy fortress that you're untouchable. You think Morty gives a damn about the girl who scrubs his toilets." Isabella backed away, but her heel caught on a protruding root. She stumbled, and before she could right herself, Tommy's hand shot out, gripping her upper arm with bruising force. The pain was immediate, a sharp reminder of the world she had tried so hard to stay hidden from. "Please," she sobbed, the first tear breaking free. "I just need 1 week." "The Sullivans don't like being ignored," Tommy hissed, his face inches from hers. "And they really don't like it when their investments start getting ghostly. This is a reminder, Charlie. A reminder that we own you, no matter whose roof you're hiding under." He didn't give her time to scream. The blow was sudden and clinical, a heavy, backhanded strike that caught her square across the left cheekbone. The force of it sent her spinning into the dirt. For a second, the world went white. A high-pitched ringing filled her ears, and the metallic taste of blood bloomed in her mouth. She lay in the damp grass, her face throbbing with a heat so intense it felt like her skin was melting. Tommy stood over her, silhouetted against the gray fog. He tucked the light envelope into his pocket and spat on the ground near her head. "Next Friday, Isabella, the full amount plus the late fee. Or I stop by your dad's place in Queens and start taking payments in fingers. Do we understand each other?" Isabella couldn't speak. She could only press her hand to her face, feeling the rapid swelling beneath her skin. She nodded weakly, her eyes blurred with tears of pain and absolute terror. "Good girl," Tommy muttered. He turned and vanished back into the tree line, moving toward the perimeter fence where he had found a gap in the Morty armor. Isabella lay there for a long time, the cold mud soaking into her blue and white apron. The silence of the estate had returned, but it was no longer a sanctuary. The peace had been shattered. The ghost had been hunted in her own graveyard. She realized with a sickening clarity that she couldn't keep the two worlds apart anymore. The blood on her lip was a bridge, and the monsters were crossing over. She forced herself to her feet, her head spinning. She had to get back inside. She had to wash her face, find some ice, and pray that the shadows of the house would hide her one last time. She crept back toward the service entrance, her hand cradling her face, avoiding the security lights that now felt like spotlights on her failure. She reached the industrial kitchen, the heavy mahogany door clicking shut behind her. She leaned against the cold marble island, the adrenaline fatting to make room for a crushing, soul-deep exhaustion. She began to sob, quiet, jagged sounds that echoed off the stainless steel. She thought she was alone. She thought the darkness would protect her. But as she reached for a dish towel to blot the blood, a shift in the air told her otherwise. The scent of cedarwood and expensive tobacco cut through the smell of the rain. A shadow moved in the corner of the room, and the sound of a silk tie being loosened was the only warning she got before the most dangerous man in New York stepped into the light. The peace was gone. The war had begun. The silence of the kitchen was no longer the empty, hollow thing Isabella had grown used to over the last 8 months. It had become heavy, charged with the kind of static that precedes a lightning strike. She stood paralyzed by the marble island, the damp dish towel forgotten on the floor, her breath hitching in her throat as she looked at the man who had been a ghost in her own life. Luca Morty didn't move with haste. He stepped out of the shadows with a predatory grace, the dim amber light of the oven hood catching the sharp line of his jaw and the cold, liquid fire in his dark eyes. He reached behind him without looking, his hand finding the heavy mahogany handle. The click of the deadbolt was a gunshot in the quiet room, a sound of terrifying finality that told Isabella the world outside no longer existed. There was only this room, the scent of expensive cedarwood, and the man who ruled New York's underworld. Luca began to slowly loosen his black silk tie, the silk hissing against his collar. He didn't ask her why she was crying. He didn't ask why she was stirring a pot of nothing at 3 a.m. He simply walked toward her, his presence expanding until the massive kitchen felt like a cage. Isabella instinctively tried to turn her face away, to hide the left side of her head in the shadows, but she was too slow. Luca reached out, his large hand cupping her chin with a gentleness that was far more frightening than violence. His thumb, calloused and warm, brushed just below the swelling. Isabella winced, a soft gasp escaping her lips, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. Luca's eyes scanned the damage, the angry purple hue, the broken skin, the way her eye was already beginning to puff shut. "Who dared to touch you?" His voice was a low, melodic rasp, devoid of volume but vibrating with an intensity that made Isabella's knees tremble. It wasn't a question. It was a demand for a name to add to a death warrant. Isabella tried to swallow, her throat dry and tight. She knew the rules. She knew her place. To speak was to invite him into a world of debt and Irish mobs that he was never supposed to see. I fell, Mr. Morty," she whispered, her voice cracking. "The garden path was wet, the fog." Luca's grip didn't tighten, but his thumbs stopped moving. He leaned in, his face inches from hers, so close she could see the golden flecks in his dark irises and the faint, jagged scar near his temple. The dominant, protective energy radiating from him was overwhelming. He didn't call her a liar, but the look he gave her made the excuse wither in the air. I don't keep clumsy ghosts in my house, Isabella, he murmured, his breath ghosting over her lips. And I don't pay for security systems that allow my people to trip in the dark. You were hit by a man who found a way onto my property. He let go of her chin, but he didn't move back. Instead, he stepped even closer, invading her personal space until she was pressed firmly against the cold edge of the marble island. He reached out and traced the line of her trembling collarbone, his fingers hovering just above the skin. The contrast was staggering, her petite, soft-featured vulnerability against his tall, muscular frame and the tattooed forearms that spoke of a life forged in blood. "You've been hiding in my house for 8 months, Lucas said, his voice reaching a level of quiet authority that demanded total surrender. I watched you turn into a shadow. I watched you shrink every time I entered a room. I thought you were just shy. But tonight, I see the truth. You aren't hiding from me. You're hiding from someone else. And they came here into my sanctuary to remind you that they own you." Isabella's breath came in shallow hitches. The tears she had been trying to suppress began to spill over, tracking hot lines through the grime and dried blood on her cheek. "Please," she sobbed. "It's not your problem. I can handle it. I just need more time. My father. He's all I have left." Luca's expression didn't soften, but something shifted in his eyes, a dark, possessive spark that claimed her right then and there. He reached out and tucked a loose strand of her brown hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering on her temple. "Nothing that happens under this roof is not my problem, Isabella. When you entered this house, you became Morty property. And no one bleeds on my property without my permission." He straightened up, his posture shifting from the intimate predator to the cold commander. He pulled a gold-plated phone from his pocket, his eyes never leaving hers. "The Sullivans," he said, the name sounding like a curse on his tongue. "I've smelled their stench on you since the day you arrived. You've been paying them, haven't you, with the money I give you?" Isabella gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She hadn't realized he knew. She thought she had been so careful, so invisible. But Luca Morty saw everything. He saw the missing NYU credits, the gambling debts of a broken father, and the Friday night meetings by the incinerator. "I had to," she whispered. "They would have killed him." "They will try," Luca replied, his voice chillingly calm as he began to dial a number. "But they made a fatal mistake tonight. They breached my walls. They touched what belongs to me." He held the phone to his ear, his gaze dropping to her lips before returning to her bruised eye. "Leo," he said into the phone, his tone carrying a weight of redirected violence that made Isabella shiver. "Wake up the house. We have a breach. And get the doctor down here. Not for me, for the girl." He ended the call and tossed the phone onto the island. The terrifying intimacy of the moment hadn't vanished. It had transformed into a promise of protection that felt like a different kind of entrapment. He stepped forward again, wrapping a hand around her waist and lifting her slightly so she had no choice but to look him in the eye. "Don't cry anymore, Isabella," he whispered, his thumb catching a falling tear. "The time for crying is over. From this moment on, your debt isn't to the Sullivans, it's to me, and I am a much more demanding master." He turned her toward the door, his arms staying firmly around her shoulders, shielding her as if the kitchen walls themselves might strike her again. As they walked toward the foyer, the house began to wake up, the sound of heavy boots on the stairs and the clicking of safeties being disengaged. The ghost was gone. The fortress was no longer a hiding place. It was a war room. And Isabella Romano was no longer just a maid. She was the spark that was about to burn the Sullivan syndicate to the ground. The house did not just wake up. It transformed. As Luca guided Isabella toward the private library, the silent fortress became a hive of lethal precision. Men in tactical gear appeared from the shadows of the hallways, their faces obscured by the dim architectural lighting, their movements synchronized and silent. Luca's arm remained a heavy, protective weight across Isabella's shoulders, grounding her as the world she thought she knew dissolved into the machinery of a war room. He sat her down in a deep velvet armchair, a relic of old-world luxury that felt absurdly out of place against her stained apron and the metallic tang of blood still lingering on her tongue. "Stay," he commanded. It wasn't a request. It was an anchor. He didn't look back as he crossed the room to a wall of monitors that flickered to life, displaying every inch of the estate in high-definition thermal signatures. "Leo," Luca barked, his voice cutting through the low hum of electronics. Leo Gallagher, Luca's right-hand man, stepped into the light. His expression was a mask of professional concern, but Isabella noticed the way his eyes darted toward her for a fraction of a second, a flicker of something that wasn't quite pity. "Boss," Leo said, bowing his head. "The perimeter is sealed. We're running the logs now. No one triggers the North Gate sensors without a ghost key." "A ghost key that only 4 people in this organization," murmured, his voice dropping to that terrifying, low register that signaled a coming storm. He turned away from the screens, his dark eyes scanning the room until they landed on a man standing near the mahogany bookshelves. Vincent Bowl was the head of the estate's technical security, a man who had been with the Morty family for a decade. He was currently sweating, the moisture glistening on his forehead under the recessed lighting. He was frantically typing on a tablet, his fingers trembling just enough for a predator like Luca to notice. "Vincent," Luca said, his tone almost conversational. "Tell me how a Sullivan enforcer walks past $20 million in facial recognition software and hits a member of my household at the incinerator." I am looking into it, Luca," Vincent stammered, not looking up from the screen. "There might have been a localized glitch. The fog." "The fog doesn't rewrite encryption codes, Vincent," Luca interrupted, stepping toward him. Each footfall on the hardwood floor sounded like a gavel. "And the incinerator is a blind spot that only the person who designed the grid would know how to exploit. I pay you to be a genius. Tonight, you look like a traitor." Isabella watched from the chair, her heart hammering. She saw the shift in the room. The other guards moved instinctively, subtly flanking Vincent. The air grew thick with the scent of ozone and impending violence. She wanted to look away, to return to the invisibility of her kitchen, but Luca's presence held her gaze. He was showing her the cost of the bruise on her face. "I have the logs, boss," Leo announced, holding up a separate tablet. His voice was cold. "A guest bypass was issued at 2:14 a.m. from a remote terminal, authorized by Vincent's private bypass signature." The silence that followed was absolute. Vincent dropped the tablet. It hit the rug with a dull thud. He didn't try to run. He knew there was nowhere to go. He sank to his knees, his face pale as ash. "Luca, please, they have my sister, the Sullivans. They took her from the clinic. They said they'd send her back in pieces if I didn't give them a window." Luca stood over him, his silhouette tall and jagged against the light of the monitors. He didn't look angry, he looked disappointed, which was far worse. He reached into his waistband and pulled out a sleek black handgun, the suppressed barrel glinting. "You should have come to me," Luca whispered. "You should have known that the only thing more dangerous than the Sullivans is betraying me. You sold the safety of this house. You let a wolf into the nursery." "Luca, please, I've been loyal for 10 years. Vincent cried, his voice cracking. "You were loyal for 9 years and 11 months, Luca corrected. "Tonight, you're just a leak that needs to be plugged." Luca didn't hesitate. The muffled thwip of the suppressed weapon was barely louder than a finger snap. Vincent's body slumped forward, the life leaving him before he even hit the floor. Isabella let out a strangled gasp, her hands flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. She had seen death in the hospital during her rotations, but she had never seen it delivered with such clinical, cold-blooded efficiency. Luca didn't spare a glance at the body. He signaled to 2 guards, who moved in immediately to clear the room as if they were removing a piece of spoiled meat. He tucked the weapon back into his waistband and turned back to Isabella. The blood on his hands was metaphorical, but the look in his eyes was stained with it. He walked over to her, kneeling in front of her chair so they were eye level. He reached out and took her shaking hands in his. His touch was still warm, still steady, despite the execution he had just performed. "That was the first one," Luca said, his voice strangely gentle for a man who had just taken a life. "The Sullivans didn't just buy a code, they bought a man's soul, and they used it to hurt you. I told you, Isabella, under this roof you are mine, and I do not allow anyone to damage what belongs to me." He had a sister," Isabella whispered, her voice trembling. And now he has a grave, Luca replied. He stood up, pulling her to her feet. He looked at Leo, who was already coordinating the next phase of the lockdown. Leo, find the sister. If she's alive, bring her in. If not, burn the clinic where they took her. Then get the cars ready. We're going to the Sullivans' territory. Luca turned Isabella toward the door, his hand resting firmly on the small of her back. The ghost, who had scrubbed floors, was gone. She was now the center of a storm she couldn't control. As they walked past the spot where Vincent had fallen, Luca didn't let her look down. He kept her eyes on him, forcing her to see the protector in the monster. The debt is shifting, Isabella, he murmured as they reached the elevator. The Sullivans took your money and your blood. Tonight, I take their empire. By sunrise, you won't owe anyone a single breath. The elevator doors slid shut, sealing them in a small, mirrored world. Isabella looked at their reflection, the petite maid in her stained apron, and the tattooed warlord who had just killed for her. The fear was still there, but beneath it was a new, terrifying realization. She was no longer a captive of the Sullivans. She was the obsession of Luca Morty, and in his world, that was the most dangerous place to be. The elevator ascended in a silence so thick it felt like the oxygen had been replaced by the scent of Luca's expensive cologne and the metallic ghost of the gunshot from the library. Isabella stared at her reflection in the polished brass doors. She looked like a fractured version of the woman she had been that morning. Her apron was stained with kitchen grime and garden mud. Her hair was a tangled mess of brown silk, and her left eye was now a swollen, angry tapestry of purple and red. Beside her, Luca stood like a titan, his expression unreadable, his dark eyes fixed forward as if he were already visualizing the destruction of the Sullivan syndicate. When the doors slid open, they weren't on the servants' floor or the main living area. They were on the penthouse level, the private sanctum of the Morty estate where no maid, including Isabella, had ever been permitted to set foot. The air here was different. It was warmer, smelling of aged leather, rare books, and the faint, sharp tang of gun oil. You aren't going back to the quarters, Isabella, Luca said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to settle in her very bones. He didn't wait for her protest. He placed his hand on the small of her back, guiding her through a set of double doors into a bedroom that was larger than her father's entire apartment in Queens. The room was a masterclass in masculine power, dark charcoal walls, a massive bed draped in slate-gray silk, and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the black, churning waters of the Sound. It was a king's chamber, and for the first time in 8 months, Isabella felt the crushing weight of the Maid label slip away, replaced by something far more terrifying. She was now a guest of the monster. Sit, Luca commanded, gesturing to the edge of the bed. Isabella hesitated, looking down at her dirty clothes. Mr. Morty, ill ruin the silk. I should go to the laundry room. I can find some ice there. Forget the silk, Luca interrupted. His tone brooked no argument. He stepped toward her, his fingers reaching out to undo the knot of her stained apron. His movements were clinical yet intensely intimate. He pulled the fabric from her waist and tossed it onto the floor as if discarding her previous life. You are done scrubbing, Isabella. You are done hiding. Tonight you stay where I can see you. He disappeared into the adjoining marble bathroom and returned moments later with a silver bowl of warm water, a soft cloth, and a first aid kit that looked like it belonged in a trauma center. He sat on a leather ottoman in front of her, his knees brushing hers. The dominant, protective energy radiating from him was a physical force. I am a nursing student, Luca, she whispered, the use of his first name slipping out before she could catch it. I can do this myself. You were a nursing student, he corrected softly, dipping the cloth into the water. Tonight, you are a woman who has been hurt under my protection. That makes this my debt to pay. He reached out, his large, tattooed hand cupping the back of her head to steady her. The touch was surprisingly gentle, a startling contrast to the hand that had just held a weapon. As he pressed the warm cloth to her bruised cheek, Isabella winced, her eyes fluttering shut. Steady, he murmured. He worked with a focused precision, cleaning the dirt and dried blood from her skin. His dark eyes remained fixed on her face, tracing every contour of her features as if he were memorizing a map. Tell me about the NYU clinic. You said you were in rotations. It was a distraction, a way to keep her from spiraling into the trauma of the night. Isabella found herself talking, really talking for the first time in months. She told him about the pediatric ward, the thrill of a successful IV start, and the dream of a life that didn't involve the dark mathematics of debt. Luca listened in silence, his thumb occasionally brushing her jawline in a rhythmic, possessive motion. As he finished cleaning the wound, he opened a tube of high-grade ointment and began to apply it with the tips of his fingers. The intimacy of the gesture was overwhelming. Isabella looked at him, really looked at him, seeing the fine lines of exhaustion around his eyes and the raw, untamed power in his gaze. He wasn't just a boss or a warlord anymore. He was the only thing standing between her and a shallow grave. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm just a maid. You have men for this. You have people to handle the Sullivans." Luca paused, his fingers lingering on her temple. He leaned in until their foreheads almost touched, the intensity of his presence making her breath hitch. "You were never just a maid, Isabella. I saw you in the hallways. I saw the way you carried the weight of the world on your shoulders and never complained. I saw the fire in your eyes even when you were trying to be a ghost." He stood up, towering over her, his silhouette framed by the moonlight pouring through the windows. "The Sullivans thought they could use you to get to me. They thought you were a weakness. They were wrong. You are the reason I am going to enjoy burning them down." He walked to a massive walk-in closet and returned with one of his own shirts, a crisp black silk button-down that smelled of him. He laid it on the bed beside her. "Clean yourself up. Sleep. My guards are outside that door and Leo is at the perimeter. Nothing gets to you here. Not the Sullivans, not the ghosts." "And you?" Isabella asked, watching him move toward the door. "Where are you going?" Luca stopped at the threshold, his hand on the light switch. He turned back, his dark eyes flashing with a lethal promise. "I am going to make sure Tommy Barnes never uses that hand again. And then I am going to erase your father's name from every ledger in this city." He clicked the lights off, leaving the room bathed in the blue glow of the moon. "Sleep, Isabella. When you wake up, the world will be different." As the door clicked shut, Isabella collapsed back onto the silk pillows. She was surrounded by his scent, wrapped in his sanctuary, and for the first time since her father lost that first hand of cards, she felt the crushing grip of fear begin to loosen. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She was something far more dangerous. She was the protected heart of a monster, and she knew, with a chilling certainty, that the city was about to bleed for her. The shift was complete. The maid was gone. The woman who remained was beginning to realize that being under Luca Morti's armor was the most intoxicating, terrifying place she had ever been. The night did not end with the cleaning of Isabella's wounds. It merely provided the fuel for the fire Luca was about to set. While Isabella lay in the expansive silence of his private quarters, wrapped in the scent of cedarwood and silk, Luca descended into the bowels of the estate where his primary convoy waited. The air in the underground garage was thick with the smell of high-octane fuel and the cold, metallic clicking of weapons being checked. Luca had traded his black silk tie for a tactical vest, his tattooed forearms now white-knuckled around the grip of a customized rifle. "The Sullivan warehouse at Pier 42, Luca said, his voice a low, lethal rasp that cut through the rumble of the idling engines. "They think they can reach into my home and mark what belongs to me. Tonight, we remind them that the only thing they own is the dirt they're about to lie in." The convoy of 4 black SUVs tore through the pre-dawn fog of Long Island like a pack of silent predators. Luca sat in the back of the lead vehicle, his eyes fixed on the blurring lights of the expressway. He wasn't just thinking about the breach of his security or the traitor he had executed in the library. He was thinking about the way Isabella had flinched when he touched her bruise. That flinch was a debt that could only be paid in the currency of the Sullivan Syndicate's downfall. They reached the industrial district of Brooklyn just as the first gray light of dawn began to bleed into the horizon. Pier 42 was a sprawling, rusted relic of the shipping industry, now serving as the main distribution hub for the Sullivans' narcotics and debt collection rackets. It was a hive of activity, guarded by men who thought their reputation for brutality made them safe. Luca didn't believe in subtle warnings. He signaled the driver, and the lead SUV smashed through the chain-link perimeter fence without slowing down. Before the guards at the gate could even raise their weapons, Luca's team was out of the vehicles, moving with a synchronized, military-grade lethality that the Irish mob was never prepared to face. "Take the perimeter," Luca commanded, stepping out into the cold morning air. "Leave the floor to me." He moved through the warehouse with the calm, terrifying focus of a man possessed. Every Sullivan enforcer who stepped into his path was met with a precision that bordered on the artistic. Luca didn't just want them dead. He wanted them to understand why they were dying. He moved between the stacks of crates, his weapon barking in short, controlled bursts, clearing the path toward the central office where the night shift's leadership was hunkered down. The air inside the warehouse became a choking soup of gunpowder, dust, and the copper tang of blood. When Luca reached the upper catwalk, he saw him, Tommy Barnes. The man was scrambling toward a back exit, his cheap trench coat fluttering behind him, clutching a satchel of cash he had clearly prioritized over the lives of his men. Luca didn't fire. He leaped from the catwalk, his heavy boots hitting the concrete floor with a thud that echoed through the cavernous space. Tommy spun around, his eyes widening in pure, unadulterated terror as he recognized the man standing in the shadows. "Morty, wait, it was just business." The girl was light on the payment. Luca didn't let him finish. He dropped his rifle, letting it hang by its tactical sling, and closed the distance in 3 predatory strides. He grabbed Tommy by the throat, his hand a vise of iron that lifted the larger man nearly off his feet. With a guttural snarl, Luca slammed him against a steel shipping container. "You touched her," Luca whispered, his face inches from Tommy's. The dominant, protective rage he had suppressed in the kitchen finally boiled over. "You walked into my house, into my sanctuary, and you laid a hand on a woman under my protection." Luca didn't use a gun for what came next. He took hold of Tommy's right hand, the hand that had struck Isabella, and placed it against the sharp edge of the steel container. With a swift, brutal motion, he crushed the bones with the butt of his sidearm. The scream that tore from Tommy's throat was loud enough to vibrate the glass in the overhead windows. "That's for the bruise," Luca growled. He didn't kill Tommy then. He left him convulsing on the floor, a broken messenger for a dying empire. Luca turned to the main wall of the warehouse, where the Sullivan's crest was painted in faded white. He picked up a discarded rag, soaked it in the dark pooling mess at his feet, and wrote 3 words across the wall in a jagged, crimson hand: "She is mine." By the time the sirens began to wail in the distance, Luca was back in the SUV. He didn't look back at the inferno his men were setting to the warehouse. He leaned his head against the headrest and closed his eyes, his breathing finally beginning to steady. The warehouse was gone, and the message had been sent, but the war was far from over. As the convoy sped back toward the safety of the estate, Luca checked his watch. It was 6:00 a.m. Isabella would be waking up soon in his bed, surrounded by his things, safe behind his walls. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, velvet box he had retrieved from the Sullivan's vault, a piece of her father's collateral that had been taken months ago. He had declared war for her, but as the sun rose over the sound, he realized that he had also declared something else. He had declared that the ghost was gone, and the maid was a memory. The woman waiting for him in the penthouse was the only thing in the world that mattered, and he would burn every pier in New York to keep her that way. The rain began as a fine mist and transitioned into a torrential downpour by the time the convoy reached the Navy Yard. Luca had insisted on bringing Isabella along, refusing to leave her at the estate while the rats he had yet to flush out remained a threat. He kept her tucked against his side in the back of the armored SUV, his hand never leaving hers. The dominance he radiated was no longer a source of terror for Isabella. It was a shield. But as they pulled onto the jagged, oil-slicked concrete of Pier 17 to meet a high-level informant who promised the Sullivan leader's head, the air shifted. The silence of the docks was too absolute, broken only by the rhythmic slapping of the Atlantic against the rotted pylons. "Leo, status," Luca barked into his comms, his grip tightening on Isabella's fingers. "Thermal is clear, boss, but the interference is spiking. Something isn't right." The realization hit a second too late. The trap didn't spring from the shadows. It erupted from the shipping containers stacked like iron mountains around them. High-intensity floodlights flared to life, blinding the Morty security team, followed immediately by the staccato roar of automatic gunfire. The SUV rocked as bullets hammered against the ballistic glass. "Get down!" Luca roared, throwing his entire muscular frame over Isabella, pinning her to the leather seat as the world outside turned into a kaleidoscope of muzzle flashes and shattered glass. The Morty tactical team moved with lethal efficiency, returning fire as they pushed toward the cover of a nearby warehouse, but the Sullivans had the high ground. A sniper's round found the gap in the SUV's door seal just as Luca shoved Isabella toward the safety of a concrete pillar. The sound wasn't loud, a wet, sickening thud, but Luca's breath hitched in a way that made Isabella's blood turn to ice. He didn't fall. He stumbled, his hand clutching his side as he pulled her behind the pillar, his face instantly draining of color. "Luca!" she screamed, the sound lost in the thunder of a nearby explosion. Stay behind me," he gasped, his voice a ragged shadow of its usual authority. He tried to raise his weapon. But his arm shook, and a dark, hot crimson began to soak through his black tactical vest, spilling over his tattooed forearms. The transition happened in a heartbeat. The terrified Maid vanished, and the NYU nursing student surged to the surface. Isabella didn't wait for his permission. She grabbed his harness and hauled him further into the recesses of the warehouse, away from the line of fire. Behind them, Leo and the remaining guards formed a wall of lead, holding back the Sullivan enforcers who were closing in like starving wolves. Luca collapsed against a stack of wooden crates, his head lolling back. The wound was high in the abdomen, just below the ribs, an arterial bleeder that pulsed with terrifying regularity. Isabella ripped open his vest, her hands moving with a clinical speed she hadn't realized she still possessed. The sight of the man who seemed invincible now lying broken in the dirt should have paralyzed her, but the scent of iron and the sight of the trauma cleared her mind. "I need light," she shouted toward Leo, who had retreated into the doorway. "And a med kit, now." Leo tossed a heavy trauma bag toward her, his eyes wide with shock at the sight of his fallen boss. Isabella didn't look up. She sliced through Luca's black shirt, exposing the jagged entry wound. The bullet had nicked the descending Yorta. He was drowning from the inside out. "Isabella, go," Luca wheezed, his hand reaching out to weakly grasp her wrist. "Leo will take you." "Shut up, Luca," she snapped, her voice carrying a steel that startled even her. "I'm not leaving you to bleed out in a shipyard." The warehouse groaned under the weight of the assault. Bullets whistled through the high windows, showering them in glass shards, but Isabella didn't flinch. She used a pair of hemostats to reach into the wound, her fingers steady despite the chaos. She could feel the heat of his blood, the vibration of his heart slowing. She had no anesthesia, no sterile field, only the raw instinct of a healer and the desperate love for a monster. She found the bleeder. With a sharp, decisive movement, she clamped the vessel, the sudden cessation of the poolsing blood drenching her hands. Luca let out a low, guttural groan, his eyes rolling back as he slipped into unconsciousness. "Don't you dare," she whispered, her forehead pressed against his as she packed the wound with Celox gauze, her tears mixing with his blood. "You don't get to leave me here. You said I was yours. Prove it." For 10 agonizing minutes, she worked under the roar of the gunfight. She cleared his airway, monitored his thready pulse, and stitched the superficial lacerations with a needle and thread meant for emergency field dressings. Every time a Sullivan bullet sparked against the crates behind them, she shielded his body with her own, her petite frame a fragile barrier against the storm. By the time the Morty reinforcements arrived and the sound of gunfire faded into the distance, Isabella was covered in Luca's blood, her hands stained to the elbows. Leo approached them slowly, his weapon lowered, his face pale as he looked at the girl who had performed a miracle in the dark. "Is he?" Leo started. "He's stable," Isabella said, her voice trembling now that the adrenaline was receding. She looked down at Luca, whose chest was rising and falling in a shallow but steady rhythm. "But he needs a surgeon, and he needs to get out of this rain." Leo signaled for the medics, but as they moved to take Luca, Isabella didn't step back. She held onto his hand, her fingers interlocked with his. The shift was absolute. She had saved the man the world feared, and in doing so, she had claimed her place in his world. She wasn't just the girl he protected anymore. She was the one who had kept the king of New York's heart beating when the rest of the world wanted it stopped. As the ambulance sped away from the docks, Isabella sat in the back, the blue lights reflecting in her tear-streaked eyes. She looked at her bloody hands and realized the truth. The price of loyalty had been high, and the debt had been paid in blood. She was no longer a nursing student or a maid. She was the anchor of the Morty Empire, and woe to anyone who tried to touch what she had fought so hard to keep alive. The recovery wing of the Morty estate smelled of sterile saline and the expensive, heavy scent of mahogany, a temporary hospital built within a fortress. Luca lay in the center of the room, his chest wrapped in surgical bandages, his breathing rhythmic and deep under the influence of the heavy sedatives required to keep a man of his restless nature still. Isabella hadn't left his side. She sat in a velvet chair, her hands finally scrubbed clean of his blood, though the memory of the warmth of his life spilling through her fingers remained etched into her skin. It was 4:00 a.m., the hour of ghosts and quiet revelations. Leo Gallagher stood by the window, his silhouette a sharp, jagged line against the moonlit glass. He was on his phone, his voice a low, frantic murmur that didn't quite reach Isabella's ears, but her nursing training had taught her to observe what others missed. She watched the way he paced, not with the protective urgency of a right-hand man, but with the erratic, jerky movements of a man watching a clock tick down. "The doctors say he'll be under for at least another 12 hours, Leo said, turning toward her as he ended his call. He tried to offer a reassuring smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You should get some sleep, Isabella. You've done enough, more than enough." Isabella looked at him, her mind racing back to the docks. She remembered the moment the sniper's round had struck Luca. She remembered the angle of the shot and the way the Sullivan enforcers had moved. But more than that, she remembered a small, clinical detail. When she had reached into the trauma bag Leo had tossed her, she had found a preloaded syringe of morphine. At the time, she had been too focused on the arterial spray to question it. But now, in the chilling clarity of the aftermath, the realization hit her like a physical blow. Morty Field kits contained powdered morphine that required reconstitution with saline, a safety measure to prevent accidental overdose or theft. A preloaded, liquid syringe meant someone had prepared for a specific, non-lethal but incapacitating injury. Someone had wanted Luca wounded and vulnerable, but not dead. They wanted him off the board so they could move the pieces. "Leo," Isabella said, her voice steady despite the roar of her heart. "When you checked the perimeter at the Navy Yard, did you see the Sullivan's lead enforcer, the one with the scarred neck?" Leo paused, his hand hovering over his holster. "Yeah, I saw him. Why?" Isabella felt the world tilt. She had never mentioned a man with a scarred neck. She had made him up. Tommy Barnes was the only enforcer she had ever seen clearly, and he was currently a broken mess in a warehouse miles away. Leo hadn't been checking the perimeter. He had been coordinating the arrival of the rats he claimed to be hunting. "I just wanted to make sure he was gone," she whispered, lowering her gaze to her lap so he wouldn't see the terror in her eyes. She needed to get to the comms console in the library, but Leo was between her and the door. She looked back at Luca. His hand lay motionless on the silk sheets. She reached out and took it, her thumb brushing over the pulse point at his wrist. It was strong. It was a promise. "I think I left his antibiotics in the kitchen," Isabella said, standing up and smoothing her borrowed silk shirt. "I'll be right back." "I'll have a guard get them," Leo countered, his voice losing its friendly edge. He stepped away from the window, blocking her path. "It's not safe for you to be wandering the halls alone, even now." "I'm a nurse, Leo. I know exactly which vial I need. A guard won't." She walked toward him, her petite frame looking fragile against his bulk, but she didn't flinch. She used the very thing they all underestimated, her status as a soft girl, to move past him. "Unless you don't trust me with his medicine." Leo hesitated, the conflict visible in the set of his jaw. He didn't want to tip his hand too early. He needed the estate to remain calm until the Sullivans arrived for the final sweep. "Fine, 2 minutes. I'll be right here." Isabella didn't go to the kitchen. She ducked into the service stairwell and ran. Her lungs burned as she reached the library, the room where Luca had executed Vincent Boll. She slammed the door and locked it, her fingers flying over the security terminal Vincent had left behind. She bypassed the primary logs, digging into the secondary encryption. There it was, a series of outgoing pings to an encrypted server in Dublin. The ghost keys hadn't just been sold by Vincent. They were being managed in real time by a secondary administrator, Leo. He hadn't just sold the codes. He was the architect of the entire war. He had used the Sullivans to bleed the Morty accounts, intending to step into the power vacuum once Luca was neutralized. The ambush at the docks had been his crowning achievement, a way to look like a hero while delivering his boss to the butcher. Isabella grabbed a tactical radio from the charging dock. "This is Isabella Romano," she whispered into the channel Luca had told her was for emergencies only. "Leo Gallagher is the lead traitor. He is in the recovery wing. The Navy Yard was a setup. Secure the North Gate. Now." The response was an immediate, chilling silence, followed by the sound of heavy boots hitting the hardwood floors outside. Isabella realized with a jolt that the house was divided. Some were loyal to the Morty name, others were already on Leo's payroll. She heard the library door rattle, then the heavy thud of a shoulder hitting the mahogany. "Isabella," Leo's voice came through the wood, no longer soft, no longer pretending. It was the voice of a man who had already decided she was a loose end. "You were always too smart for your own good. I should have let Tommy kill you in the garden." Isabella backed away from the door, her eyes searching the room for a weapon. She found nothing but the heavy glass decanter on the bar. She gripped the neck of the bottle, her knuckles white. She wasn't a ghost anymore, and she wasn't just a nurse. She was the only thing standing between the man she loved and the man who had sold his soul for a throne. "The trap is already set, Leo," she shouted, her voice echoing off the bookshelves. "The loyalists know. The gates are locked. You aren't leaving this fortress." The door splintered. Leo stepped through the wreckage, his weapon drawn, his face a mask of cold fury. But before he could level the gun, the sound of a low, familiar rasp cut through the tension of the room. "She's right about one thing, Leo." The voice came from the hallway, weak, but carrying the weight of 1,000 deaths. Luca Morty stood in the doorway, leaning heavily against the frame, his white bandages soaked through with fresh blood, a silver-plated 1911 steady in his hand despite the tremor in his legs. His dark eyes were fixed on Leo with a Promethean rage. "You aren't leaving this fortress alive." Isabella didn't wait. She lunged forward, not away from the violence, but toward the man she had saved. The trap wasn't just the security codes or the locked gates. The trap was the woman they all thought was a victim. She had kept the king alive, and now the king was back for his crown. Final echoes of gunfire had long since faded into the salt-cracked air of the Long Island Sound, replaced by a silence that was no longer oppressive, but absolute. The Morty estate stood as a monolith of reclaimed power, its limestone walls scrubbed of the night's chaos, though the memory of the purge lingered in the crisp morning air. The Sullivan Syndicate was a ghost of the past, their influence dismantled in a single, coordinated strike that had seen their leaders fleeing for a border they would never reach. The internal rot had been excised with the same clinical precision Isabella had used to save Luca's life. Vincent Boll and Leo Gallagher were names now spoken only in cautionary whispers by the men who patrolled the perimeter. Isabella stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of the master suite, wrapped in a robe of heavy black silk that felt like a second skin. The transition from the girl in the blue and white apron to the woman standing in the heart of the empire had happened in the space of a heartbeat, forged in the blood she had spilled and the life she had saved. She watched the sun rise over the water, a jagged line of gold that seemed to mirror the fire she had discovered within herself. She was no longer a nursing student mourning a lost life, nor a maid hiding in the shadows of a kitchen. She was the architect of her own survival. A heavy, familiar warmth settled against her back. Luca moved with a slight stiffness, his side still heavily bandaged, but the dominant, predatory energy he radiated was undiminished. He wrapped his tattooed arms around her waist, his large hands splaying across her stomach in a possessive, grounding hold. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the scent of her hair, no longer smelling of industrial cleaner, but of the expensive jasmine and cedarwood that defined his world. "It's done," Luca murmured, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that resonated through her chest. "The Sullivans are a memory. Your father is at the safe house in Vermont, guarded by my best men. He'll never see a debt collector again. And Barnes will never hurt anyone ever again." Isabella leaned back into him, her head resting against his shoulder. She looked at her reflection in the glass, the petite, soft-featured woman held in the arms of the most dangerous man in New York. The bruise on her cheek had faded to a faint, yellowish ghost, a mark of the night that had changed everything. She wasn't afraid of the monster anymore. She had realized that the monster only roared for her. "And Leo?" she asked softly. "Buried where the world will never find him," Luca replied, his grip tightening slightly. "He underestimated you, Isabella. They all did. They thought you were a weakness I was indulging. They didn't realize you were the only thing keeping this empire from falling apart." He turned her in his arms, forcing her to look into the dark, intense depths of his eyes. There was a new level of reverence in his gaze, a respect that transcended the protective obsession of the past few days. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that still had the power to make her breath hitch. "The house is yours," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper of terrifying finality. "The men answer to you. The accounts are in your name. You aren't a guest here, and you aren't a ghost. You are the queen of the Morty family." Isabella didn't flinch. She reached up, her fingers threading through the dark hair at the nape of his neck, pulling him down until their lips were inches apart. The fear that had defined her for 8 months had been cauterized, replaced by a cold, strategic clarity. She understood now that power wasn't just about the guns or the money. It was about the loyalty of the person standing beside you when the world was on fire. "I am not a nurse anymore, Luca," she whispered against his mouth. "No," he agreed, his lips brushing hers. "You're the heart of the machine." An hour later, the heavy mahogany doors of the grand dining room swung open. The long table, carved from dark oak and polished to a mirror finish, was set for breakfast. But the seating arrangement had changed. At the head of the table sat Luca, his black shirt unbuttoned at the collar, his presence commanding the room even in his recovery. And at his right hand, the seat traditionally reserved for the underboss, the seat Leo Gallagher had once occupied, sat Isabella. She wore a tailored dress of deep emerald green, her hair tied back in a sleek, professional knot. She looked at the men gathered around the table, hardened soldiers and tactical experts who had spent their lives in the service of violence. They didn't look at her with the dismissive indifference they showed the house staff. They looked at her with a wary, profound respect. They had heard the stories of the Navy Yard. They knew she was the reason their boss was still breathing. Mrs. Gable entered the room, carrying a silver tray. She stopped short, her eyes flickering to Isabella in the seat of power. For a moment, the old hierarchy threatened to resurface, but Isabella simply met the woman's gaze with a calm, steady intensity. "Thank you, Mrs. Gable," Isabella said, her voice clear and carrying an authority that needed no volume. "You can leave the coffee. Well, take it from here." The head housekeeper bowed her head, a genuine, deep gesture of submission, and set the tray down before retreating silently from the room. Isabella poured a cup for Luca, her movements fluid and confident. She wasn't serving him, she was partnering with him. Luca took the cup, his dark eyes never leaving hers as he raised it in a silent toast. The war was over, but a new era had begun. The Sullivan and Morty conflict had been the forge, and the love that had sparked in a dark kitchen at 3:00 a.m. had been the flame. As they sat at the head of the empire, Isabella realized that the terrifying finality of the locked door months ago hadn't been an ending. It had been an invitation. She had walked through the fire as a maid and emerged as a sovereign. The invisible girl was gone, and in her place stood the untouchable queen of the Morty Empire, a woman who knew exactly what it cost to survive, and exactly what it took to rule. The saga of Luca and Isabella proved that true power wasn't just about ruling the underworld. It was about the lengths a man would go to protect the woman who had stolen his heart, and the lengths a woman would go to save the man who had given her a reason to fight. From a sobbing maid in a dark kitchen to the strategic heart of a mafia empire, Isabella's journey was complete. She was safe. She was loved. And she was, above all else, finally free. The story of Luca Morti and Isabella Romano offers a compelling look at the intersection of vulnerability and power. Beyond the high-stakes drama of the mafia underworld, we can draw a core lesson about the transformative nature of protective loyalty and the reclaiming of agency. 1. True strength is often hidden. Isabella begins as a ghost, defined by her fear and her perceived helplessness. However, her background as a nursing student, a healer, becomes the very thing that saves the monster who protects her. The lesson here is that vulnerability is not a permanent state. Our past skills and internal resilience are often just waiting for the right catalyst to be converted into power. 2. Silence is a breeding ground for predation. Isabella's flaw was her belief that she had to suffer in silence to protect her father. This silence allowed the Sullivan syndicate to breach Luca's walls. The story teaches that shame and secrecy empower the abuser. It was only when Isabella's injury was brought into the light, into Luca's sight, that the cycle of victimization could be broken. 3. Protection is a two-way street. The narrative arc shifts from Luca protecting a maid to Isabella saving a warlord. This illustrates that the strongest bonds are not built on one-sided rescue, but on mutual indispensability. 4. The terrifying finality of choice. When Luca locked that kitchen door, it represented a choice for both characters. For Luca, it was the choice to make a stranger's problem his own. For Isabella, it was the choice to stop running and start trusting. The lesson is that one decisive moment of courage can rewrite a lifetime of victimhood.